suis contente de vous accueillir pour cette avant-dernière conférence dans le cycle L'araméen dans tous ses états. Et je remercie vivement Charles Häberl d'avoir accepté de présenter aujourd'hui sur le mandéen, qui est un de ses domaines de spécialité. Et je rappellerai en particulier la traduction parue dans les Translated Texts for Historians d'un important livre des rois et explications du monde, qui est une forme de chronique avec des parties assez différentes les unes des autres, qui est un texte qui intéresse à la fois les spécialistes, bien sûr, du mandéen, mais aussi les spécialistes des christianismes anciens, des études zoroastriennes et également de l'islam, puisque le genre du texte se rapproche de beaucoup de genres connexes dans d'autres religions. Charles Häberl a travaillé sur beaucoup d'autres textes mandéens, publié des traductions notamment et des introductions extrêmement précieuses pour les non-spécialistes. Et il a étudié toutes sortes de langues anciennes et nouvelles, à la fois aux États-Unis où il a suivi sa formation, puisqu'il a obtenu son doctorat de l'université de Harvard, et il est actuellement professeur à l'université Rutgers, et il a été le directeur notamment du Centre des études orientales, et du département des langues orientales et moyennes orientales. Il s'intéresse également à d'autres formes d'araméen, et notamment au touroyo et aux différents dialectes touroyo parlés au Tourabdin. Et donc, il a commencé un travail de description et d'étude de ces différents dialectes en Turquie. Et il aura sans doute, je l'espère, l'occasion de venir nous en parler lorsque ce travail sera plus avancé. Mais en attendant, aujourd'hui, il va nous parler du mandéen. Thank you so much for accepting to cross the Atlantic just for this talk. We're very happy to have you here today. So the floor is yours for this presentation on Mandaic.
Thank you very much, and thank you for being so accommodating with me. This is my first opportunity to lecture in Paris, and I apologize for speaking in the English language. I'm not confident in my French abilities, but I hope that you'll be able to follow me. If I'm speaking too quickly, or if my accent is too strong, please do not hesitate to slow me down. So, to begin, I would like to explain to you why I engage in these studies of Mandaic and why I think it's so relevant to other areas, including some of the ones that you mentioned. The study of the ancient Near East, of early Christianity, of Judaism, and many other things. And this may not be immediately apparent from what you find in the scholarly debates over Mandaeans and their origins, their language, and such. So I shall dedicate most of my talk to explaining both ruptures but also continuity in the history of Mandaic. The first thing I'd like to draw your attention to in this flyer, which I've based upon the one for your conference brochure, is the date. You may notice beneath the Gregorian calendar date, I give you an example of the date in the Mandéen calendar. Mandéens follow a different calendar, one of 365 days, which they divide into 12 months of 30 days each, plus a period of 5 intercalary days, position between the 8th and the 9th month. And the most significant about this date, this calendar, is its world era, which initially comprised 480,000 years, ranging from the creation of Adam to the end of the world. The last 1,000 years of which were assigned to the zodiacal sign Pisces, stretched from Sunday, the 10th of February, 322 BCE, to Friday, the 4th of June, 678 CE. Now, when the world did not in fact end in 678, Mandéens added an additional age, an 8th one, after the 7 ages which had previously been governed by the 7 visible planets. As the Abbasid-era text, the Diwan Haranguetha, attests. Thus, we find ourselves today in the 8th Mandéen age, according to Haranguetha, and the year 481348, after the creation of Adam, according to the Genzaraba, the chief scripture of the Mandaeans. Allow me to start by introducing you to the speakers of this language, the Mandaeans. Mandaeans are an ethno-religious community formerly resident in the region around the head of the Persian Gulf, in what are today southern Iraq and the Iranian province of Khuzestan. As elaborated in their sacred texts, such as the Genzaraba, the core of their faith is a doctrine known as Nasirutha, or Nazarenism, the adherents of which are therefore most frequently called Nazareans in their sacred texts, or Nasurai in Mandaic. Within this group, these texts occasionally distinguish between a clergy, or Taramidutha, and a laity, Mandayutha. And this latter word, which comes from their word for knowledge, or Manda, furnishes us with a useful term for the entire complex of beliefs, culture, faith, and practices associated with this doctrine, namely Mandaism. Thus, its followers are often called Mandaeans, although we could just as easily refer to them as Nazareans or even Gnostics using a Greek word for knowledge, gnosis, in place of an Aramaic one. To the non-Mandaean neighbors in the region, they are most commonly known as Asabi'una, or Sabians, employing a term lifted from the religious vocabulary of the Quran, but this last designation is conspicuous by its absence from their classical literature. Sometimes they are also known as Baptists, after their most characteristic ritual, Maswata, which entails immersion in flowing water, or yardna. And this is an image of them engaged in this very ablution. They're obviously an extremely photogenic people, and that's just one of many reasons to study them. The language that they speak is a form of Aramaic, as you are now well aware, one of the spoken languages, or perhaps families of languages, with the longest history of attestation, starting in the 10th century before the Common Era, and continuing to this present day, a period of over 3,000 years. This means that literatures in Aramaic have the same historical depth as those in languages such as Akkadian, Chinese, and Hebrew, although obviously and unfortunately, there are many fewer speakers than Chinese today. This depth presents unique opportunities and challenges for the study of these languages. Opportunities to query the corpus of Aramaic languages for historical and comparative purposes that few other literary corpora offer us today, but challenges in that the members of this family are so diverse and so distinct from one another that few scholars attain mastery of more than one, and almost no scholars working on the corpus of classical Aramaic have any degree of mastery of the spoken languages, and vice versa. In order to come to terms with this historical breadth and depth and diversity, scholars tend to divide the language according to different schemes, such as the one I'm showing you right here. So these are 3 basic periods according to the scheme of Klaus Bayer. Others may differ. Fitzmyer has 5. Some would consider Achaemenid, official or imperial Aramaic, to be its own stage intermediate between Old and Middle. Others would place it under Old. But in general, Mandaic pertains to the Middle Aramaic languages that you see here, and uniquely among them, it survives to the present date, in both spoken and written form. There are also a smattering of living Neo-Aramaic languages spoken in a kind of archipelago, roughly along the lines of what was called once the Fertile Crescent. Starting in the west, in the city of Ma'alula in Syria, and also Jab'adin, there was formerly a form of Aramaic spoken in Asarha, or Baha it's called as well, but it is no longer spoken there. No one lives in Baha except for the lizards. So now this language, Western Aramaic or Syrian, is today spoken only in those 2 villages that I mentioned. And then finally, among the Eastern Aramaic languages, we find Neo-Mandaic, of course, Toroyo or Surate, and the various languages grouped together as Northeastern Neo-Aramaic. Now, none of these other Neo-Aramaic or modern Aramaic languages have written instantiations before the early modern period, which makes Mandaic all the more precious. Just as we can trace the development of the broader family of Aramaic languages over time, Mandaic has obviously been around long enough for us to trace its individual development along similar lines. For Tedel Neuliker, who was the first philologist who systematically documented the grammar of Mandaic, the literary texts at his disposal fell into 2 broad categories: Old Mandaic, those texts such as the scriptures and the liturgy putatively dating to the period before the advent of Islam, and characterized by the lack of Arabic and Neo-Persian loanwords, and what he called young mandaic, those texts such as the priestly handbooks and the illustrated diwans or scrolls that demonstrate considerable Arabic and Neo-Persian influence and which therefore likely belong to the period after the advent of Islam. For these reasons, those texts that were subsequently recovered from archaeological excavations in contexts that we can securely date before the advent of Islam may be grouped together with the former texts, although they present their own grammatical peculiarities, as has been documented by generations of scholars, starting with Henri Pognon and more recently Ohad Abudram. The premier mandaic grammarian of the 20th century, the Slovak linguist Rudolf Matsuch, rechristened Notluka's categories as classical and post-classical mandaic, even though mandaic texts were never subjected to the same level of elaboration as those from truly classical languages such as Greek, Latin, Hebrew, Arabic, Sanskrit, and Chinese. Prior to the 19th century, there were no mandaic school texts, no grammars, or even dictionaries, with the notable exception of a single word list from the now extinct dialect of Iraq, prepared by a missionary sometime in the 17th century. Even though Matsuch's preferred terms classical and post-classical were something of a misnomer, they have gained broad currency among those who discuss mandaic today, and for this reason I'll use them here. To those two stages of the language, Matsuch also added a third, modern or neo-mandaic, the existence of which previous scholars such as Samuel Zwemer and Stefana Drauer had documented, but which had remained undescribed until Matsuch's critical intervention. We can therefore speak of as few as 3 stages, such as those here, or as many as 5 stages, separating epigraphic mandaic from the classical texts, and separating the extinct Iraqi dialect from the modern living ones. But arguably this is not necessary because for what we gain in precision from these further subdivisions is not matched in utility or explanatory powers. Mandaic has some distinctive features vis-a-vis the other Aramaic languages. The most obvious are in its phonology, including these features here, the loss of the so-called guttural consonants, which are either deleted or merge with their glottal equivalents, the resolution of doubled or geminated consonants through anticipatory dissimilation. And what I mean by that is that it transforms a long doubled consonant into a cluster of a nasal and a short version of that same consonant, a singleton. And a general rule against too many so-called emphatic consonants, which were likely glottalized in Mandaic, at least in the classical period, in a single word, along the same line as Geer's law and Akkadian. We might easily describe all of these features as Babylonian, since they are similarly found in Neo-Babylonian, Akkadian. And the most parsimonious explanation of this fact is that some ancestor of Mandaic was in contact with Neo-Babylonian before it became extinct. For Mandaic has preserved these features more consistently and to a greater extent than all other Aramaic languages, including those also attested in Babylonia. I might also add here, based upon the written language, that Mandaic's vowels are distinguished by quality rather than quantity, and that there was a chain shift of the front high vowels, which caused the nominal morphology to become completely restructured, because the old Mandaic plural morpheme, which was probably pronounced something like a, and the third masculine singular possessive pronoun, which is probably also pronounced something like that, but open rather than closed, became homophonous, together with the indefinite morpheme e, which was borrowed from the Iranian languages. In fact, Mandaic has a lot of loan morphemes not found in other Aramaic languages, and it uses the old synthetic genitive, also known as the construct state in the grammars, to a greater degree than other Middle Aramaic languages, certainly more than Syriac, which generally prefer an analytical genitive with the genitive marker d. And now this latter marker, the d, completely disappeared from spoken Mandaic. It's not used today. It is, however, preserved in the other living Aramaic languages, whereas the construct state died out in other spoken Aramaic languages. Thus, modern Mandaic took a different evolutionary path than all of the other spoken Aramaic languages, in this regard and in others, as we shall see. This is also true for the verbs. Mandaic preserves the Old West Semitic suffix conjugation, or katal, sometimes also called a perfect. But as the written texts demonstrate, the Old West Semitic prefix conjugation, yiktul or nektul, sometimes called the imperfect, progressively fell out of use. It was initially reserved for arealis contexts, but gradually was replaced, even in such contexts, by an innovative participial present tense, as you find in other living Aramaic languages. Thus, Mandaic is probably the second most conservative Aramaic language today, at least in terms of its verbal morphology, after modern Western Aramaic. Finally, thanks to the large Mandaic literature, which I shall shortly introduce, the Mandaic lexicon is particularly well documented, and it contains a lot of very conservative words lost in other Aramaic languages, as well as extensive evidence for language contact, principally from the Iranian languages, but also Akkadian and even Greek, even if there's less Greek influence than, say, Syriac for obvious reasons. The Mandaic literature also preserves some very old Hebraisms not found in Syriac, or even in some of the Jewish Aramaic languages employing the square script, attesting to a history of contact with Jews that remains largely unwritten today, primarily because many scholars still doubt Mandaeans had much contact with Jews or Judaism. Now, about that literature, as I promised, according to one tradition, a being from the worlds of light, by the name of splendid Häberl Ziwa, entrusted the proto-human Adam with 10 books, which included the Genz Rabbah, great treasure, or perhaps great library of books, the Book of John, Drashidihya, the Book of the Zodiac, Asfar Mawashi, the Scroll of Inner Haran, or Diwan Harangwetha, the Scroll of Awathar, Diwan Hawathar, the 1012 Questions, or Elf Tresa Ishioli, the Scroll of Exalted Kingship, or the Diwan Malkutha Eletha, the Book of Souls, Sezot Nishmotha, the collection, Kalesto, and the responses of the devotions, or Enyonid Rahmi. These 10 books, and most particularly the Genz Rabbah and the Book of John, are among the most frequently copied and most frequent to be met in the homes of Mandaeans, both priestly and lay. Not included among these titles are the frequently copied priestly handbooks, of which Bogdan Burtea has recently edited and translated several, and numerous other illustrated and unillustrated scrolls, such as the Scroll of the Rivers, or the Diwan Nahrotho, which are said to be 24 in number. Today, most of these texts have been translated, but very few have been published in critical editions. There's plenty of work to go around. Matthew Morgenstern estimates the entire size of the known Mandaean scriptural canon as roughly 860,000 words. This is approximately 1.54 War and Peaces, 2.82 Hebrew Bibles, 3.24 Ulysseses, 4.67 Greek New Testaments, or 5.45 Qur'ans. And this number does not obviously include the incantation texts, such as the Rotuli and the Terracotta Bowls that I'll discuss in a second, but it does include some interesting magical texts preserved in manuscripts from the late 19th century. Many of those magical texts are paralleled by the epigraphic texts, the bowls and the scrolls, thus demonstrating a kind of continuity in magical practices in texts from the Sasanian period, if not much later, up until the present date. Paradoxically, our scriptural canon, which is preserved in much older manuscripts, including many of the ones that you can visit in the Bibliothèque Nationale, cannot be traced so far back. But passages from one of these manuscripts, the Book of the Zodiac, or Asfar Mawashi, directly parallel those found in Achaemenid and Seleucid era cuneiform astrological texts. For historians of the more recent eras, these manuscripts also represent an untapped treasure of raw historical data in the form of their colophons, with which copyists conclude entire manuscripts and often even discrete sections within such manuscripts. These colophons serve a dual purpose for would-be historians. First, they indicate the names of the copyist, or nasocho, and the client for whom the manuscript will serve as a remembrance on earth and a seal in the great worlds of light, as well as valuable and often unique information about the circumstances under which they were copied. So, for example, Ram Bakhtiar Bar Behram Shaudan, who is the copyist of the oldest surviving manuscript of the Genzeraba, wrote on the 28th of June, 1561, about the region of Hoveze in which he lives, and its Mushashai ruler, Sajjad ibn Buntran, who ruled from 1541 until 1587. In addition to various local Muslim and mandéen authorities who may or may not appear in other records. Secondly, and more importantly for my purposes here today, they document the entire chain of custody whereby each portion of the text has reached the present copyist. These formal aspects of the colophons illustrate two key mandéen beliefs concerning their manuscripts, namely that their reproduction is meritorious for both the copyists and their patrons alike, and they also place a high premium on the pedigrees of their manuscripts. In the words of Drower's informant, Hermes Bar Anhar, now a person who possesses a Genzeraba, his name will remain in this world, and in the world to come, the Genzeraba protects his soul from harm, just as a tree spreads its branches to shelter his head from the sun. That being the case, it is more than a little surprising that the colophon chains of the Genzeraba are relatively short. For example, in the final colophon of the right-hand volume of the Genzeraba, this book, the sacred Bible, so to speak, of the Mandéens, is 2 volumes, one of which is called the right-hand volume, and the other is called the left. The right hand is much larger, concerns this world. The left hand includes much of the liturgy, but also concerns the fate of the soul after death. And when you're done reading one part of it, you turn the entire manuscript upside down, and you begin reading from, as it were, its back cover. So when I refer to the right and the left Genza, that is what I am referring to. So our scribe, the scribe of the oldest manuscript, the one that's present here in Paris, writing in 1561, as I said, identifies himself as the latest in a chain of 14 copyists since a certain Yahya Sambar Sarwan. By comparison, the earliest manuscript of the Book of John, Drashidihye, is this other text, also in Paris, which was completed by someone by the name of Zahrun Baradem in Basra on October 13th, 1616. That copy was already in its 30th edition, according to Zahrun's reckoning. Mark Lidzbarsky hypothesized that the Book of John was an Islamic-era supplement to the Ginza, but if we assume that were indeed the case, why are the chains of copyists in the Book of John so much longer? As Jordan Buckley notes, based upon the colophon of a manuscript of the Book of John from Flushing, Queens, the antecedents of Sabine 10, or 10, were evidently copied far more frequently than those ancestral to the Flushing manuscript. But even so, the longer John chains across all the manuscript traditions are very perplexing. Additionally, the colophons in the post-classical priestly literature and portions of the liturgy are far more extensive and go further back than those in the scriptures, suggesting that the classical works of mandéen literature circulated independently for a time and were only later incorporated into this priestly literature and the system of colophons that characterize it. This is yet another mystery, a mystery that has not yet been solved by scholars working on this material. All right, now, as I mentioned just a little while ago, our earliest examples of Mandaic, our earliest evidence for the existence of the Mandaic language, and indeed of Mandéens for that reason, are inscribed upon terracotta incantation bowls and lead rotuli. Right, so the former are basically garden variety common terracotta salad bowls of the sort that you might even buy today. And what the bowl enchanter, the sorcerer, has done, has written, often in spirals, but sometimes also in lines, an incantation around it to do various things. These incantations had many effects. They could deflect curses and bad magic. They could trap demons. They could even, in some instances, curse other people for the benefit of the clients. And they're quite extensive. There are many hundreds, if not thousands, of these bowls in museum collections and in private collections all around the world, and only a small fraction of these have ever been published. And as you might imagine, the circumstances of the preservation, very often at the topmost stratum of archaeological excavations, and other writing don't really lend themselves to easy reading. This is, in fact, one of the clearest bowls I've ever seen. But because they are so formulaic, because so many of the incantations fall within certain described categories of spells, they're easy for philologists to reconstruct, even from very bad copies. And we have, unfortunately, very few such texts recovered from archaeological excavations. Most of them appeared on the black market, for which reason we don't know much about them, but we do know that they do start appearing in the archaeological record in the century or centuries immediately prior to the advent of Islam, and they continue after the Muslim conquest of Iraq, but for a short time. And this is evinced by the presence of some Arabic and evidently Muslim names in some of the later bowls. There are some bowls in the square script, sometimes called Jewish Aramaic incantation bowls, that have dates to the 5th and 6th century, if I'm not mistaken. Very few of them, but they exist. So another datum, a point of data in favor of a pre-Islamic existence of these texts. And then finally, our scrolls. As far as I know, none of these have been uncovered in archaeological contexts. I could be wrong. Are presumed, based upon script analysis, to be older than the bowls. These are inscribed upon lead rolls, and they're often much more extensive, and the material they cover is, in fact, more diverse than the material in the bowls. But unfortunately for us, they're also extremely difficult to read. I mean, as you can tell just by looking at them. And not all of them, even those that are in Western museum collections, have been published in critical editions. Although there are teams of people, primarily in Israel at Tel Aviv University, engaged in this work even as we speak. So, the fine spots of these incantation bowls attest to the mandéen's long-standing presence in central and southern Mesopotamia, even if mandéen texts more frequently reference places in the Levant, where, thus far, no mandéen artifacts have been found. And, this could mean many things, right? It's an argument from a vacuum. It's an argument from the absence of something, which is a very easy argument to counter because we could tomorrow discover some sort of mandéen artifact in the Levant. We just haven't. Or it could mean that Mandaism, as we understand it, emerged in a Mesopotamian context. Many of these places here, where bowls were found, did indeed become, according to the scribal colophons, centers of mandéen life. Right? Remember again that our earliest manuscripts are 16th century. Therefore, the colophons necessarily start with copyists in the 16th century, but they also preserve chains of copyists going back many centuries, and they situate some of these copyists and some of these schools of copyists in cities such as Thebes, right there. You can see on the east bank of the Tigris. This brings me to the discussion of the Mandaic script. As I mentioned before, we tend to date the lead scrolls, at least since the time of Mark Lidzbarski, the lead rotuli, I should say, as earlier than the bowls, and that's based upon script analysis. I have illustrated these scripts here, and also I'd like to discuss their origins alongside those of the scripts with which it has been most frequently compared, specifically Elumaic, formerly used in Khuzestan, and Kerosenian, which is sparsely attested from legends and mint marks on coins issued in the Iraqi region of Maysan or Masini. And these are both, obviously, regions in which Mandaeans lived up until quite recently. In 2006, I compared in an article the Mandaic bookhand and the epigraphic Mandaic script with a constellation of scripts ranging from Armenian in the north down to Khuzestan and Masini in the south, concluding that each of these scripts shared a ductus, influenced by the Parthian chancery script, and that the immediate context for their adoption was the Arsacids' abandonment of Hellenism after the middle of the 1st century of the Common Era, after which the Parthian client kingdoms in the same exact regions where Mandaeans are found today switched from the Greek script to a highly local, increasingly cursive and ligatured form of the Aramaic script. In my analysis, the Mandaic script, both the bookhand and the epigraphic script, is among the most conservative members of this group, due to its preservation of strokes that have been lost or ligatured in the other scripts. And you don't have to be a scholar of Aramaic to take my word for it. You can confirm this just by looking at the coins issued in Kerosene in the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era, right? It looks, that's this fifth column. It looks quite a lot like Mandaic, and for that reason, Cookson and others have said this is the origin of the Mandaic script. But I draw your attention to the letters Bet, this one. This is a B, right? This one, this is supposed to be a K. And then this one, this is supposed to be an R. Now, notice how they are more or less identical, right? The Mandaic script preserves all of these distinctly, right? Let's take a look. There's the book hand, right? This is the one. And then this one, right? So now it's sort of a truism in the study of scripts that you very seldom get characters moving from identical to different without the introduction of diacritics. So among, for example, the Parthian scripts, right, because the similarity of many of these same characters, including the D and the R, they innovated a dot beneath it, the D, to indicate the difference from the R. And this is also borrowed by Syriac. Mandaic keeps these characters distinct from one another, suggesting that this was innovated after the period the Mandaeans had adopted this script. So again, an Arsacid or Parthian period context. Thus, we may conclude that Mandaeans must have adopted their script, which is a form of Aramaic influenced by the Parthian chancery script, around the same time as their neighbors in Elymaeus and Caracini, but they preserved it to a greater degree than they did, attesting to a continuity in the preservation of this script and perhaps other cultural institutions as well, from the Parthian period, if not earlier. Although I have organized this previous script into a chart to illustrate its similarities and differences from other Aramaic scripts, this is not how a Mandaean would have traditionally organized his or her own script. In the Mandaean literature and in contemporary spelling practices, the 22 distinct characters of the Mandaean script, right? There are 24 letters, one of which is halqa, or A, the letter with which the alphabet begins. Another one is a ligature of the characters D and Y. But in the 22 letters that are distinct, these are organized into a number alpha syllabary of 79 hagioni, or characters. This is another unique adaptation, characteristic only of Mandaeans today. No other Aramaic script communities are organizing their script into an alpha syllabary. And this is a, ba, ba, bu, bi, and so on and so forth. So when people actually, when Mandaeans spell out, right, they don't say a, ba, so on and so forth. They would say a, ba, bu, gi, da, and so on and so forth as syllables. And if it's a letter that, for example, the B there that doesn't come accompanied with a vowel, it's not syllabic, right? They would say eb lethi mendi, eb without anything. So Mandaic spelling is not like other Aramaic spelling. The value of these 79 hoyoni, or syllables, is illustrated in this chart here from the Book of the Zodiac, Asfana Mawashi. And at first glance, the numbers appear to be completely random, because they are not derived decimally, but rather according to a modulus of 12. That is to say, if you add up the individual value of each character and keep the unit, rather than the decades or the centuries, you'll come upon the numerical value of this number, from 1 to 12. Therefore, A, is equal to 1. And ba, the syllable ba, is equal to 1 plus 2, 2 plus 1, or 3. And B is equal to 10 plus 2, or 12. Right? That's as high as it goes. U, on the other hand, U is only equal to 4. Why is that? Because in a base 12 system, right, if you add 12 and 6, you get basically 1/4. It's represented that way because the decades are 12 rather than 10 as in our system. So we don't get 6 or 16 or anything like that. We get 4. And that's the logic according to which this entire chart is structured. Both adaptations, right, the organization of their letters into syllables rather than individual characters, script characters, as in other Aramaic scripts, and this mod 12 system, this sort of weird base 12 system, point to the influence of another number system, one which employed 12 as its base, or at least as a factor, and which paired numbers with syllables. Logically, this hypothetical number syllabary must have existed when Mandaeans adopted the numeral system and adapted it into a number alpha syllabary, thereby retaining some aspects of this earlier numeric system. Right? We may hypothesize that they came up with this all on their own, but that would not be the most parsimonious explanation. We in fact find such number syllabaries organized along the same lines as this table in the cuneiform tablets of the Achaemenid and Seleucid period, once again. And they are the only surviving parallel to the Mandaean number alpha syllabary from the same region. These number alpha syllabaries, however, are something of a mystery because we lack the greater numerological context within which they were employed, which is something that we have and frankly take for granted with its Mandaean equivalent. Could this be yet another survival of an ancient Mesopotamian cultural institution in Mandaic? Or must we ignore this earlier evidence and assume that Mandaeans independently invented or innovated a very similar system for similar purposes centuries after the last stylus made its final impression upon wet clay? That's a rhetorical question I don't think is possible, but you may disagree with me. One last, extremely archaic, or perhaps better archaizing feature of the script is its orthography. A fact that has been noted by generations of students of Mandaic, and a feature of the script which is credited by literate Mandaeans, Luffy, as critical to mastery of the written language, since Mandaic words are sometimes written in a manner completely unlike their spoken equivalents. So I'll illustrate this with some examples that I've put here on this slide. There are a lot of Mandaic words which, when spoken, include a d, but are not pronounced d or after a vowel the, but rather written with a z. And this includes the words dahwa in modern Mandaic, which is often written zahba, but occasionally dahba. Dukna, and that means gold. Dukna, which means beard, which is occasionally written Dukna in Mandaic. I transcribed these for your benefit. But also written Zakna. And that's all right because, for example, in the Canaanite languages, this is the reflex of these same terms. Zaken in Hebrew, Zahav for gold. But then we get to words like Dewa, wolf, right? They have been in Arabic, which have no business having a Z here, right? This is a hypercorrection. This is an archaizing, unetymological spelling of this word. It could not have arisen from any spoken language. It is instead a way of endowing Mandaic writing with a certain antiquity, hearkening back to an earlier stage of the language. Similarly, the word dama, white blood, right, dam in Arabic, is written sometimes zama. So say besro zamma, right? That's not how it's pronounced in modern Mandaic, but that's how it's written if you need to know how to write Mandaic really well. And dekla versus zekla. So these are unetymological spellings. There's absolutely no reason for them to be spelled that way. There are some words in which the Z has persisted in modern Mandaic, and one good example of this is zambura, or zambur, which means hornet, right? Compare this with, in Jewish Babylonian Aramaic, you have zibora, whereas in Syriac, the closest cognate is deborifo. And then there's also zachoyo, innocent, or maybe victorious. In Jewish Babylonian Aramaic, we have zakai, whereas in Syriac, it would be zaka'if, right? So this I would actually credit with influence from Akkadian, in which these words also exist, and which presumably was in contact with some ancestor of Mandaic, from which Mandaic borrowed these words. Now, the alternation of T versus Esh, which is characteristic of, for example, Old Aramaic, is very uncommon in Mandaic for whatever reason. But there are some examples. For example, Aturpi mini notar, its leaves do not fall from it. Ulnasha bakufa horitto, and it falls into the other cup. Right, this is the same verb, but sometimes it's written with a T, sometimes it's written with an Esh. This may also represent the influence of an Akkadian verb. nasharun, which means the same thing. To deduct, take something from, reduce, maybe pour out. So, we have some very ancient appearing Q forms, where otherwise in Mandaic we have a glottal stop or nothing at all. So, for example, the word arro still exists in modern Mandaic, is almost always written arka. It looks like that spare line of Aramaic in the book of Jeremiah. Akna, also written ana, pronounced ono in modern Mandaic. And ak amra, versus amro, means wool, right? There's a Q there. But again, we have some completely unetymological examples, right? Afro, in modern Mandaic, meaning dust, appears both as akra and akapra, but there's absolutely no reason for that Q to be there. This is another example of a writing practice, an archaizing writing practice, which endowed Mandaic with a certain illustrious antiquity. And then, as I mentioned before, we have prenasalization. So, for example, the word afak is sometimes written anpek but never pronounced that way. Or the word for face, appo, is written in classical Mandaic appi or anpi. But it's not pronounced that way in the modern language. And we have reason to doubt that this particular sound change was ever very productive in Mandaic. It's evidence of language contact, to be sure. And if we want to go so far back as to say an ancestor of Mandaic was in contact with Neo-Babylonian, Akkadian, then this would be evidence of that sort of contact, because Babylonian Akkadian had plenty of examples of this. And that's presumably where Mandaic came from, because this sound change is not regular and exceptionless in Mandaic today. And evidently was not in the classical period as well, as evidenced by the large number of biforms. And then finally we have something I call silent D. So the word shatta for year, right, is written sometimes with a D, or I would say most of the time is written with a D that's not pronounced. And the word gappo, or wing, also written with an unetymological D, right? We may question why this is the case. I would say perhaps it's a productive analogy with the word for ear, which is onno in Mandaic, but written odno. That is an etymological D, right? To reiterate, all of these features are characteristic of Old Aramaic, and to a lesser extent, Achaemenid, official or imperial Aramaic, but they have disappeared entirely from the Middle Aramaic languages. Yet we find them alive and well in Mandaic. How can we explain the reemergence of these ancient archaizing spellings in such a late form of the language? This too attests to some degree of continuity with past centuries going back even before the Christian era. Otherwise, we have to assume that Mandaic priests and Mandaean priests alone uniquely preserved some text in Achaemenid Aramaic, which no other communities preserved, and they use this as the basis for these archaizing orthographies and spellings in their new form of the script, which it seems a little dubious. I'd like to leave you with some conclusions. To start with, where I began, Mandaic is an Eastern Aramaic language, first attested among other Middle Aramaic languages, but uniquely surviving to the present date, and it's characterized by certain things that set it apart from all other Eastern Aramaic languages, including its conservatism, certain loan vocabulary, and other features which I've adumbrated in the lecture up to now. Both its written and its spoken forms differ from other Eastern Aramaic languages, primarily due to its long-standing contact with other languages such as Akkadian and other various Iranian languages. Mandaic colophons provide the raw material for a comprehensive history of the Mandaeans and their place within the region from below, particularly from the 16th century, but potentially for earlier centuries as well. Certain institutions which are today uniquely characteristic of Mandaeans and of Mandaic, such as the calendar, the magical text, the script, the archaizing orthography, and the alpha syllabaries, evidently survived from the Hellenistic period, if not much earlier. The proximate epoch of the Mandaean calendar, right, the more proximate one, at least of the age of Pisces, is Sunday, the 10th of February, the year 322 before the Common Era. which is, of course, the year of Alexander the Great's death and the coronation of his half-brother, Philip Aridaeus, for which it is sometimes known as the Philippian era. This millennium continued until Friday, the 4th of June, 678, whereupon the 7th era of 480,000 years since the creation of Adam came to an end. The archaizing orthography continues Achaemenid era Aramaic scribal practices, vestiges of which are preserved in Biblical Aramaic and Pahlavi as well, but which have become completely obsolete among Middle Aramaic languages, save Mandaic. The Book of the Zodiac preserves passages from the Mesopotamian astrological texts belonging to the Achaemenid and Seleucid era, paralleling the preservation of incantation texts in the epigraphic sources from before the advent of Islam and in late 19th century paper or parchment manuscripts. And the only, of course, precedent for the Mandaic duodecimal number alpha syllabary are the much older cuneiform number syllabaries. Unlike them, however, the Mandaic number alpha syllabaries are preserved within their broader numerological context, which provides us with invaluable data for interpreting the cuneiform number syllabaries from which they undoubtedly derive. On the basis of all this evidence, I can conclude that much about the history of Mandaism and the dating of its literature remains contested without any scholarly consensus, and the lack of a scholarly consensus over such issues, and frankly the abundance of raw data, suggests that the greatest discoveries in the study of Mandaic and of Mandaism are likely yet to be made. Thank you very much.